Hi, T, how is it?
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our live stream. We are so happy to have you here. My name is Terra Vance, and I am the CEO of NeuroClastic. And I want to give everyone here a chance to introduce themselves. And thank you all for being with us. I see the audience is still coming in. I'll hand it over to Tanya, and then you can pass it on. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Tanya Malnichuk from South Africa. I established the Autistic Strategies Network, which is a loosely organized group of autistic people. I'm particularly active with the rights of non-speaking people in Africa. I also help to bring to Africa a method for non-speakers to be able to communicate using letterboards, which you'll hear more about this evening. And another focus area that I have is health. Let me hand over to TJ.
Hello, my name is TJ or Tiffany. I write for the social media profiles Nigh Functioning Autism. I am autistic, so are two of my children. And I live in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And I am currently learning to be a communication and regulation partner at Reach Every Voice in Rockville, Maryland.
Thank you, Evie and Ian.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Vossler. I am the Executive Director of IASC, the International Association for Spelling as Communication, and I'm also the Director of Growing Kids Therapy Center. And this is my friend Ian Nordling. Mostexcited, most excited, Tobehre. Most excited to be here.
Awesome. And Ben.
H then E L L O. Hello. A then L L, and then Y N A M E. Hello all. My name. Yeah, you got it. I then S U E N. B then R. E then A U. A U then X. Hello all. My name is Ben Breaux. I then A M. I am. Yeah. Got it. What? Up here. A T W E N T then E Y then E then E then A R O then L D S C L L A D D then V O C then all the way up A then T E. Hello all, my name is Ben Breaux. I am a 21-year-old self-advocate.
Thank you so much. And thank you to our panelists for being here. Thank you. We have 38 people live right now, and it's very likely that in the next few days we'll have hundreds or thousands of people viewing this. So we're so happy that everyone who's taken the time to learn about the Spillerverse and motor disinhibition, which has been the topic of the day, has invested their time in this very important topic. You may have not understood the ways that motor disinhibition and OCD and other topics we've been talking about apply to you. and you've probably been masking potentially even symptoms of Tourette syndrome. And so what motor disinhibition is not being able to always control the movements of your body and of your mouth and the words that come out. And the opposite end of that is apraxia or dyspraxia, and that's not always being able to plan and execute the movements that you want to do. And so we're going to talk a lot today and answer your questions about spelling. And what spelling means is when someone points to letters one at a time to spell. It's a type of teaching and using communication. And within the Spellerverse, there are three primary different, we call it the Spellerverse, and it kind of encompasses these three different modalities, and that is facilitated communication. That's when a person is physically supporting or touching in some way a speller to help give them feedback so that they can stay focused and point to letters on a letterboard or device. And there's also rapid prompting method, or RPM, and spelling to communicate, and that is what Ben and Ian are doing today. Is that does not have supported typing. No one is touching them. They're pointing to letters on a letterboard. And so that's the Spellerverse, and that also encompasses their communication partners and allies and people who are involved in the spelling community. So welcome to the Spellerverse today. We're happy to have you. We had a couple questions before, and please leave your questions in the chat and we'll get to them, because this is not a lecture. We're here to answer your questions because everyone has had a lot of questions. And probably the most common question we've seen is, what should parents, teachers, and educators do to support non-speaking kids if they are not sure if the child's behavior or echolalia or scripting is purposeful communication? And so who wants to take that one first? I know Ben has prepared an answer for that one. I feel like, Evie, that is a good one for you to start with.
Can you also add that into the chat?
Sure can. Maybe. I can do my best. While I work on that, let me get to a shorter one. How do I know what behaviors to ignore and what ones to respond to? Or what ones are disinhibition and what ones are purposeful? And that question is for anyone. Ben is answering, and so is Ian.
I think just to add, while Ben and Ian are busy spelling, to point out to some people watching that although these problems often affect non-speakers or unreliable speakers, they can also affect people who appear to be highly articulate with their mouth. And we may seem in some situations so-called normal or passing as normal to a certain extent, but we may have severe problems with some of these issues without people actually realizing that. Some people also who seem as if they can communicate fine and that speech is what they mostly use, may not actually be comfortable with speech whatsoever and might do better with other communication devices. And so what you're hearing from them, even though they are answering the questions contextually, they just sound very intellectually disabled when they answer using speech. And that might not be what they intended to say. or that not at least not to the level of depth which they actually wanted to answer. Their answers might be a lot blander than what they intended.
And I think Tiffany has, or TJ has talked about this some too, on their social media profile. And I also have experienced this a lot. And a lot of times I say something that is nothing like what I intend or want to say. It's very hard to coordinate my thoughts and my speech sometimes. And so what comes out might sound hostile or just totally different. It doesn't sound like it came from me. Go ahead with that, TJ. I think your sound is off.
I don't think you always know. Sometimes when it happens very quickly without the processing ability, like for me when it happens personally. I am learning this with students as well.
And Evie and Ian, are you ready?
We're ready. Ian said, that one is tricky. I don't have very reliable control of my body. Sometimes I mean what I say, sometimes I don't. So in S2C, we talk frequently, this is now me answering this part, frequently about 4 types of motor. There's reflexive, impulsive, purposeful, and automatic. And reflexive motor is like if I throw a ball at your face and you see it coming, you're going to turn your head away or blink or close your eyes. That's reflexive motor, and it's subcortical, it's protective, and there's no cognitive neurons there, right? Because it's triggered at the level of the brainstem or the spinal cord, and we don't have thinking neurons there. So it's protective. Impulsive motor is triggered at the level of the amygdala or the limbic brain. Also both subcortical, no thinking neurons, so it's not cortical there. Amygdala's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is actually a new term that was introduced to me by some neurodiverse occupational therapists, and that's kind of that pleaser thing that can happen as a response to fear, anxiety. We see a lot of fight or flight. We're in our amygdala, feeling very anxious. And so that can result in hitting, hair pulling, head banging, a variety of motor that doesn't have control. And there's no thinking neurons there. So it by definition is not purposeful. Then we move into purposeful motor, which involves the primary motor cortex, the sensory cortex, and the supplementary motor cortex, which is right in front of those 2 areas. Sensory guides the motor, so motor and sensory can't be separated, and the supplementary motor cortex is responsible for movement on demand. So that's the process of I have an idea, I make a plan, I execute the plan, and I adapt. So if I'm thinking to myself, wow, I'd really like some coffee, right away, because I'm not apraxic, my hand starts moving towards my coffee cup. But if I'm looking here at the screen and not at my coffee cup, I might miss it. So my hand is just hitting air, right? Like, whoops, no coffee cup there. So I can do one of 2 things. I can adjust and turn my head towards my coffee cup, get a visual on it, so the sensory gives my motor feedback, or I can just kind of pat around and I can, find my coffee cup and bring it to my face, right? So there's why I adapted my motor. That's purposeful motor, and that's intentional. And then finally, we have automatic motor, which is when you practice something purposeful enough times, it moves to automatic. So anybody who's got a motor skill they can reliably do, at one point it was purposeful, right? Because babies are not born with anything other than reflexes. And any skill you've learned how to do, from holding up your head to rolling over to walking to driving to handwriting to using a fork, then that was at one point purposeful. If you had to learn it, it was intentional. You practiced it over and over again. till it became myelinated, and now it's automatic. So sometimes in the moment, you can't tell if someone is doing something reflexively or impulsively. I find a lot of those motor actions are what people label as behaviors, but a real behavior means there's intention of it. Like anyone who ever grew up with siblings and purposely wanted to annoy the sibling, right? Like, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you, I'm not touching you. That takes purpose and intention. That's right there up in your cortical area. When it becomes automatic, it bypasses some of that cortical. It's still cortical, but you're not thinking about it so much because it's so well myelinated. That was a long explanation. I hope that makes sense.
That was an excellent. I feel like we really needed that, and I want to check in with Ben to see if you have something to say in response to that question, the original question. Believe you might have just had your screen freeze for a second.
Oh, okay. Ben said, sometimes it is hard for me to decipher this myself, but it's really about knowing your body, and even then it can still be tricky to know.
Thank you so much. And I think that is a big reason, the most important reason that we make sure that people have reliable communication, and that we do not let motor planning and disinhibition prevent someone from getting the kind of communication that they need. And this is one of the biggest barriers. Parents ask us all the time, how can we start? Where can we start? Where can we go to start understanding and empowering our children to be able to communicate what they want when they have apraxia and motor disinhibition? And also, just a quick note to the audience, motor disinhibition and apraxia are different from mutism. While they may have some neurological similarities, the impact on a person's life is very different. Where a person with mutism, or who can speak sometimes but has a lot of difficulty with speaking for various reasons, usually more related to anxiety than motor planning, has people believe that they are choosing not to talk, that they're shy. They might doubt that person's intelligence, or think that they are being, giving people the silent treatment on purpose, or they don't want to participate. That's different from having everyone, going your entire life with everyone treating you like a pet or like a toddler, which is what happens to a lot of apraxic autistics with motor disinhibition. People hear the sounds, they hear echolalia and see behaviors and movements that they associate with intellectual disability when it's not related to and that's not to say that someone can't have both intellectual disability and motor planning and disinhibition differences, but that we always have to strive to get them the most reliable communication that we can. And so that it's just something that we need to always keep in mind, and is critical for supporting our kids. So is there anybody prepared to answer that question yet? Do I need to repeat the question? Okay, so the question was, or let's This is close enough to it. Let me put this up. Is your motor planning better or worse sometimes, depending on the day and what factors influence it? That is a very good question from Zoe Reed. And Zoe is on our advisory board for restraint and seclusion, and is part of the International Coalition Against Restraint and Seclusion, or ICARS. You see us sharing posts from them sometimes.
Tara, I have a comment. I don't think it's for this last question, but
That's
it goes
okay.
back a little bit. Ian said, sometimes an action is happening. I am aware of it. I can't stop it. Understand that I don't want to do this and I'm embarrassed by this. And this is something we hear a lot of times from non-speaking people who will say, it's almost like they can see this action happening, or they're aware that their body is doing it and they don't want to do it, but they can't stop it. So, it's both the apraxia and the disinhibition teaming up together.
Yes. And this happens to me as well. And there are times that even before I knew I was autistic, I wrote about what I called motor loops, and they're actually called motor loops, where I would get stuck doing a behavior and I couldn't stop. One thing that I could not make myself quit doing is sanding. So I was sanding a tabletop. I wanted to refinish a piece of furniture, and I just kept going. My muscles had been twitching for hours, like cramping. I was sweating. I was crying. I had sawdust in my nose and mouth and lungs and all over my face, caked up in my sweat and tears. I literally could not stop until my partner had to come home and support me to exit that motor loop. And I've had some motor loops that I don't want to describe that were self-harming. And I was horrified by it, but I just could not make myself quit doing it in the moment. And so one quick other thing is we often have parents write us. Their children have said things that they've heard other kids say as just scripts, echolalia, and their kids have been suspended or expelled from school. And that is why they've been assaulted by other students. And that is why we have to never use the phrase, all behavior is communication. Behavior is often communication. All behavior is an indication of something, that a person has a nervous system, but not that it's communication every time. I feel like, TJ, do you have... Okay, go ahead.
For me, that is definitely true. Anxiety, whether or in epilepsy or affect how much body control I have or whether or not I can override my body's actions.
That was OCD.
Right. And when you have focal epilepsy, which is a less obvious to outside people form of epilepsy, where it is not the full seizures that you see on television that have convulsions and look very dramatic. There are lots of types of seizures, and lots of autistic people experience seizures, myself included, and they are often misinterpreted and misunderstood as intentional behavior. Do you have something? Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, because seizures can look so very different, and there are so many types. One of my friends she's autistic, and I didn't mention that in the beginning. She has 3 autistic children, and one of them has what is called Gelastic Seizures. So what this means is you laugh when you have a seizure. He doesn't always remember it afterwards. He doesn't quite remember everything that happened during that, but he remembers he's just had a seizure, but not everything that he said. But she said one of the problems with his seizures is it's not just a matter of, like you get all giggly. He starts laughing in a way that sounds like you're trying to be offensive, like you're trying to be a diabolical monster in a movie. It goes like that, and that sounds like somebody's putting that on purpose and putting on an act to just annoy everybody, which could very easily be punished if it's misunderstood. You get another kind of seizure, which is the opposite, which people cry. So all of these things, people don't know that seizures can look like that. They will just think that this must be intentional because it just doesn't happen when you see the person acting in a different way, usually. If they were acting that way all the time, then you just say, well, that person's totally crazy. But because at other times they're perfectly calm, they could even have a conversation, and then suddenly this happens, you assume that it's being done with intent. The other thing I just want to also add about seizures, one of my friends at the age of, I think she's about 33, 35 now, just recently got diagnosed with temporal lobe epilepsy, which I had not known basically affects your emotions. So instead of the ones that the public is probably most familiar with in terms of seizures would be tonic-clonic seizures, where you start shaking and go kind of unconscious, and then tremors and everything. But with a temporal lobe epilepsy, you might be sitting there, nobody notices any different, but what you experience as a person is the worst, most overwhelming flood of every single emotion that you could possibly have. So if you then respond, if you're in the middle of a conversation and you're having a seizure and somebody says something, your reaction to that may look completely disproportionate to what that person has just said, because you're just coming out of this flood of emotions which come from nowhere. If you don't know what it is yourself, because you haven't been diagnosed, you get diagnosed with borderline personality disorder because of the extremes of emotion. You get told that you're acting out, you're overreacting, overly emotional, just trying to create drama. So these actions, you can't help all of those emotions. So you respond in what you might say or do, or what your body does to all of those emotions. And it is a seizure. It is measurable by neurologists as a seizure.
Yes, well, that's what happened to Matthew Rushin. If you've been following NeuroClastic for a while, Matthew Rushin was a college student, and he suddenly he had a fender bender. Someone hit him in a parking lot, and he was overcome with this extreme, like the worst fear and anxiety imaginable. We couldn't breathe, and he had that is a pre-seizure sign usually, and then he had a focal seizure. And afterwards, it caused a car accident. Afterwards, he used echolalia. A man said, "Were you trying to kill yourself?" And he repeated that, and they used that as a confession and sentenced him to 50 years in prison. Now, he has since been pardoned. That was a very hard fight, and he spent time in prison as a young autistic man because he had a seizure. And so this is why we cannot say all behavior is communication. Does somebody have something to add now? I don't want to put anyone on the spot, but definitely don't want to leave anybody out either.
Ian had said, to Zoe's question, is your motor planning better or worse? Sometimes depending on the day, what factors influence it? And Ian said, my motor is different for me at any time. It depends on my emotions or if I'm tired or sick or hungry. So in S2C, we refer to, this either as state regulation, right? Where you are physically, that can be hot, cold, hungry, tired, sick, any number of things that have to do with your body, or emotional regulation. And that happy is just as dysregulating as sad, right? Or scared. And sometimes if you think about like a little kid before a family vacation who just didn't sleep at night because they're so excited, or any lottery winner, right? They're kind of falling apart because they're so excited. That's an example of dysregulation due to emotion. So we can have any of those things. But yeah, Ian says it's constantly different for him. And he's working on another question as well.
Okay. Ben, did you have something, or are you still working on a thing? I think the screen froze again for a second. This.
If Ben is still busy,
It's on so many factors. It depends on my energy, my with the moon cycle, and more.
Can you play that one more time because it kind of skipped?
Press it again because you answered it earlier.
Yes, it varies.
Oh, the timing to have it skip for a second. So for Ben, it varies depending on different circumstances. And this is a question that we get all the time that I feel like maybe Evie or Kelly might want to answer first. Why do some apraxic people need to use a letterboard instead of an electronic AAC device? And this is so important, and I am very excited to hear. Kelly, do you want to take that one? Or Evie?
Kelly's giving me the nod. She can piggyback on top of it. So and then I'd like to have Ian and Ben respond in too for Ian or for why we do this as with letters. That the most robust communication we have as humans is through our digits, right? Which are our fingers and toes, and our articulators, which are the moving parts for speech. So in spelled and typed communication, what we're doing is we're taking the motor out of the digits and articulators and putting it in the easier to use gross motor of the arm, right? If you are able to learn and practice that gross motor to accurately spell. So in Ian and Ben's case here, they're so accurate that I'm just receiving the letters. There's nothing that I'm doing. They're getting the questions from you. I'm just kind of the mail carrier. I'm receiving the letters and I'm writing them down. But with 26 letters, that's infinite possibilities, right? And those of us who don't have apraxia or communicate with any form of typing or texting, we're using 26 letters. So language is infinite and flexible, and this allows them on one, if you will, screen, right? One surface to access 26 letters. Ian could also be typing. This is just faster for him. So this allows infinite, robust communication, pulling the motor out of the digits and the articulators and having access to being able to spell anything that they would like.
I think I'd like to just add a little bit something that I've learned from a lot of people who use these methods. If you have to go straight to a device, which is as small as, for example, my cell phone or another handheld tablet, and you do not yet have the accuracy, what can easily happen, and I've known so many spellers say the same thing, is that because their mind gives an instruction, but the hand doesn't interpret it properly, it works a little bit like spasticity. And it's not that they've used that word, but it's easier for us from the outside to understand, I think. We understand that with spastic people, a person who's got spastic movements, the movement is not accurate. So I'm trying to point over there, but I'm kind of going off to the side. This is worse than that. Instead of that, it's just not accurate. It's actually a completely different movement which comes out. So if you have only a small screen with two choices like yes, no on there, you could very well point to yes when you mean no. And an example of that would be one of my fellow activists in South Africa. His name is Nicholas Paulsen. He is a high school student. And he used to go to a family restaurant with his family, and then they would ask him what he wanted to eat. And so then they give the menu to him, and then, he'd kind of like point to something on the menu. They assumed he wanted a beef burger. And then his mother one day just decided to check using the letterboard, where he would have to spell things out as opposed to just pointing to one thing. She asked him what he'd like, and he said, "I'd like the same as my sister's having, please." And she was having something completely different. So that's one of the problems with, if you just try to go straight to an AAC device with somebody who has a problem with purposeful movement, where the thought is supposed to go directly to just the one thing that you want to point to. But instead, and it's been explained like this by many non-speakers, I'm just thinking of Jordan Pallet, for example, kind of described it this way. Ido Kadar has also described it this way. The thought is going, like, instead of just going straight, the thought goes and it goes through a maze, and then by the time that it comes out, it's pointed in a different direction. So with a letterboard and with a straight arm and with a big movement and having to point to every single letter, you've got a much better chance of not having that impulsive accidentally pointing to the wrong thing. And then over time, of course, you get trained, your body gets quite fit in this. And then you could potentially go over into just typing, because you know how to override the issues with your brain. So the non-speakers here can tell me to what degree I've explained it accurately, but this is basically what I've taken from all the non-speakers that I've learned from so far.
And just this week, we were going to post this as a separate quote from Trevor Bird, who is a contributor at NeuroClastic and also just my hero. I love Trevor so much. But Trevor said that the AAC devices that he was given were the things, basically they were used as control. He was only given the choice to say the things that other people wanted him to say, not what he wanted or needed to say. And when we have demand avoidance, which is related to OCD and like a sort of paralysis for not wanting to follow demands that sometimes even we want to do, but just being demanded, having demands placed on you as opposed to autonomy can become paralyzing and infuriating. I'm like that. As soon as you tell me not to do something, I'm likely to do it, even burn my own house down, metaphorically. Just I will destroy myself before I let someone else control me. And so when we exert too much control on autistic kids, we continue to punish them for acting out because they have neurological differences that we are making worse by exerting too much control. And having limited AAC is a part of that. So that was one thing. TJ, did you have something you wanted to add?
I know in speaking with some of my non-speaking friends about AAC, there's been anything from like it being like a traumatic type of experience with AAC to even some simple things like they can't track as well on that electronic device, or they can't. So a lot of autistic people have ocular apraxia. If you have apraxia or dyspraxia, for other things, it's likely that you have ocular apraxia or some other fine motor issues when it comes to vision. And the AACs at least the high tech ones, not always. Um, well, first and foremost, we barely identify these issues in people, and then expect them to be able to use the AAC. But the AAC is harder in issues with eye tracking, ocular apraxia, and then again, like I said, the issues with it being kind of traumatic the way it was introduced to them, and yeah, it's just traumatic. Just the way the teachers, the schools, speech therapists, and families have introduced it or used it, and that's why some do not. That's what I've learned from them directly. That's just yeah.
And to show you how these things are not limited to just non-speakers and unreliable speakers. I could not read until 5th grade. I have very high test scores at the end of the year, but I couldn't, and everyone accused me of faking, being lazy, and I had a hard time writing too. And it was because of dyspraxia or apraxia, especially the visual and what's called Erland syndrome, which is not well defined yet, but it's being able to visually track line for line. The reason I did so well on those standardized tests at the end of the year, they were in 24 font. There were 2 questions per page. And they didn't have the Scantron bubble sheets with the little tiny bubbles. You just had to circle the whole answer that you wanted because they were hand scored back then. And so it wasn't that I maybe couldn't read, but I couldn't read fluently because my eyes couldn't track small text. And no one believed me ever. And I suffered a whole lot because of that. I was trying harder than everyone else, and everyone was telling me every single day that I was lazy. I spent my whole life in detention for not working, but I literally couldn't. It was because I could not focus my eyes and track the text. And so that, if you notice, a letterboard is extremely boring. It's usually black, solid color, and they start with the larger stencils, and maybe Evie can talk about that a little bit more. But they're less visually distracting. There are fewer choices, and that is another reason that AAC can be difficult. The electronic devices. Evie, did you have a thing?
Yes, Ian's got several things that he's added from the questions. So first he said with regard to, devices and picture based, he said, I'm not good on an iPad. And now I'm adding to that. I think that, I say this a lot to people who are not apraxic or have the same kind of motor problems, is how many people, would choose to send an email of a paragraph or two either on their phone screen or an iPad screen. And almost everybody's like, no, I would never do that. I would go to a keyboard, because even for people who are not apraxic, that gives the tactile. It's kind of obnoxious to type on glass. So Ian starts with saying, I'm not good on an iPad. And then with regard to picture based, he said, when there are icons or pictures, I likely touch the same picture over and over. So that, he's getting into those motor loops and so forth. And then when you were talking about demand avoidance, Ian kind of vibrated and he said, I agree with you, Terra. I hate being controlled. It saws into my anger. I want agency in my life. And now, me adding in, I think, that's the thing about communication, is that it gives agency. what it is that you want to say, expressing your thoughts and opinions, not being controlled by others because you have a say in the conversation and about your life. And that's, to me, the very, essence of communication and why communication is so critical.
Thank you. And Ben, did you have something that you wanted to add?
For me, I sometimes have a hard time hitting the right letter. It can be the hardest thing. Purposeful fine motor planning. I also suffer from tunnel vision, which makes it difficult to hit a small key versus a wide space.
Yeah, there you have it. And did you have something, Tanya?
Yes. I don't know what my specific problems are called because I started reading when I was very young, and I started speaking when I was very young. But I realized at some point when I had thought of doing a postgrad degree, at one stage I wanted to do an MBA. Not something I ever want to do now. I don't think it's a necessary kind of degree. But it's my stage. And I realized how much reading there would have to be. Now, many people, because I'm very articulate and because I have knowledge on many subjects, they assume that I can read well. And because I started reading precociously, I mean, I started reading before I was 2 years old. But I would not be able to handle the reading that is necessary for a postgraduate degree. I read a lot of articles, but I can't really read books well. And what I've discovered is that the aids that are recommended for people with dyslexia, which I do not have, I can spell fine, and unless I have ADHD and I make homonym mistakes and so on, and I get distracted. But otherwise, I don't really think I have dyslexia. But I relate to the things which are needed for dyslexics. Now, things that both Ian and Ben have said are relatable to me in the sense that if I am faced with a screen which has a whole lot of choices on it, at the time that I struggled severely with sensory overstimulation, I had to use quite a lot of dyslexia aids. I would use, if I was reading a book, I would probably prefer to read with a reading window. I specifically chose my cell phone so that it would serve as my reading device because I struggled to read books. So in spite of being, I teach professionals and so on, I don't really cope with reading books. And I think it has to do with some of the eye movement issues which you spoke about earlier, that I am reading on the screen now. I'm sitting with my cell phone. I'm reading what the questions are below. But my span of vision to be able to do that, to be able to read, it says there, Ian, I agree with you, Terra. I had been controlled by my anger. I want agency in my life. That's easy to read because it's within this. When I have to read a book, usually it's as if the movement that I have to do there, my eye tires of that very quickly. And then I don't sustain my attention. So multiple icons with multiple pictures, and plus with most AAC devices, if you want to say everything that you really want to say, if you're using the icon-based ones, you have to go to a different menu to get there. It's not that everything that you want to say is going to be available to you on one screen, like 26 letters are available to you if you're just typing in the regular way. You have to do this, then you have to switch to that menu to be able to get access to those things, then you've got to select that thing. By the time you've done all of that, you've kind of lost the track of the thought. So you've got the two problems with the ASC devices. They work well for some people. They work well for some people, for example, who have selective mutism, which is another term you can talk about, like, is that really a good term? Because it's so confusing. It sounds almost like elective mutism as if you choose, which is not the case. But so in other words, if you have no problem with your fine motor control, if you don't have too much of a problem with concentration, then that kind of device will be a good AAC device for you. But it's not going to be a good AAC device for everybody. And I think by bringing in the struggle that I have with the eye situation, it just shows that these problems can be pervasive throughout autistic people without us even necessarily having apraxia. Now, to just add one more, I want to just add something about a friend of mine. She's autistic, but not only autistic. It was the first thing for which she got a diagnosis, but she later got a diagnosis for fetal alcohol syndrome and for a bunch of other conditions. And there's some things which are not yet diagnosed. She recently only found out that she had a brain deformity, brain damage. It's called inferior vermis hyperplasia, which means the back of the cerebellum is lopsided. There are many cerebellar problems, in other words, with the back, the movement part of the brain, in autistic people, in many autistic people. And these things are only now found to also, everybody thought that your movement brain was your cerebellum. It's just to do with that. And your thinking brain is your cerebrum, and then your emotional part is in your amygdala and your limbic system. But now it has been found that cerebellum actually has quite a lot more to do with all of these other functions, and the brain is quite a lot more integrated than we thought it was. One non-speaker particularly, who has, I don't know whether he would allow me to mention his name, so I won't do that part, but he's been doing cerebellar exercises, which he gets from a cerebellar expert on YouTube, which has helped him not only with his movement, but also with his emotional regulation, which once again goes to show there's a lot more happening in emotions in the cerebellum than we were led to believe before. So to just close out, because I get ADHD and then I go slightly off topic, but to just come back to my friend in the movement. So I have the problem with, I think, something to do with my eye scanning. My friend with the brain injury, she has nystagmus, which is, I'll see that I can simulate it and go closer to the camera. It's when you do something like that with your eyes, you don't voluntarily move your eyes, but you know, they kind of go all over the show. So what happened to her when she was in a university class was she would sit there and the eyes would do this, and the eyes would do that. And the lecturer became extremely angry with her because she's partially blind and partially deaf, she was sitting at the front of the class so he could see her eyes very well. And he thought that she wasn't agreeing with what he was saying, that she was going, oh, rolling her eyes, you know, like this lecturer is stupid. He got so angry with her, he chased her out of the classroom. So you can see the level of misunderstandings you get with people who are sitting in a university class, with people who appear to be articulate, in addition to if you have enough of a struggle that you don't actually speak. So it's pretty pervasive.
And is there someone waiting who has something ready to contribute before we move to something else?
And wanted to go back to, I think, Tanya, that's such a great example of, that's not communication, right? Nystagmus, or, you know, even tics and lots of movement is not communicative. And it's so frustrating that when someone's trying to interpret your outside body. Ian, in answer to the question of why is it harmful to say that all communication is action, he said, the words and actions I make are rarely intentional. I am not communicating anything.
Yeah. And that, for me, I have tic disorder or Tourette's, depending on how bad it's been when I go to a neurologist, because they use clinical and behavioral criteria. So sometimes they've been bad enough in recent months. Things like an infection, strep or mono, can make your disinhibition much worse. And that doesn't just mean your physical tics and movements, but also your intrusive thoughts and getting stuck in a thought loop or a motor loop that is horrifying. I can't begin. There was a show in the 80s called The Highlander, and the first, the opening song, it started with the I am immortal. And I am 41 now, and that one line from that one song has been playing in my head sometimes like 20 hours a day. I can't sleep because of it. I don't know the rest of the words to the song. I just that one line. And I'll get, people call them an earworm, but they will torture me. I'll look at a string on the floor and I'll start thinking, and I'm not a very religious or spiritual person, but I'll think, is a demon about to start pulling that string? Is it about to move? Do I need to look at the ceiling to see if there's a demon hanging upside down? I don't believe in that. It's just my thoughts. I'm sitting at a table with people. Am I about to turn this table over? I'm going to turn this table over while everyone's eating. And things like that go through my head all the time. Or I'll think embarrassing thoughts about another person that my conscious mind would never think. One reason that I can't do cameras is I will get so afraid that I'm going to copy someone else's movement that I will maybe start copying their movements. And I'm afraid they'll think I'm making fun. But I've been in faculty meetings before and professional conferences, and I've gotten so afraid that I was going to do something like stand up and scream. It's just stand up and scream a swear word in the middle of a conference. That the urge has become so overwhelming that I'll slam my hands down on the table. Cannot help it, scare everybody in the room. And yeah, it's not communication. It is just, it's a tic. It's me trying to suppress my tic, so I'm biting the insides of my jaws. I know a lot of autistic people are going to relate to this. Do you have permanent ridges on the insides of your cheeks from chewing them? Because if you do, that is a part of you suppressing your motor disinhibition. You're trying to not externalize. Or do you have broken teeth from grinding your jaws? Have you had to have surgeries on your jaw like I have from just grinding your teeth constantly? I don't have many molars left, and they won't replace them because I will just break those as well. I'll chew through any mouth guard in 3 minutes. Because I'm trying so hard not to do other tics. Or I'll get a giant knot on one side of my neck and look like Quasimodo because I'm ticking on only one side. And it's spasticity, Yeah, somebody out there relates to me. If you have gnarled, barely left fingernails from chewing them up and you're embarrassed of how your hands look, you probably have motor disinhibition. If you move your mouth a little bit while other people are talking, that's motor disinhibition. And so if you're afraid that you're going to pick up other people's accents and insult them like you're culturally appropriating, but you can't help it because it's just, you start picking things up that other people do. And it's not your conscious mind, that's your brain. There's a difference between your brain, which is an organ, right? It's just a thing that transmits neurotransmitters, electricity signals, and your consciousness. Your consciousness is your personality, your values, your whatever soul or spirit means to you, your free will. Those are not your brain, that's your consciousness. And so your brain can make you have these thoughts and movements totally separate from what you want. And that's why not all behavior is communication. So anybody have something to add right now?
I think there's a question that maybe we should also throw into here. Nobody's asked it, but I do know that people are going to be watching afterwards who might not have come to this. Where does something like ABA feature in all of this? What does it do? What does it not do? What's it good for? What's it bad for? How does that work when we have these inhibitions?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Does anybody want that before I get on a soapbox?
Yeah, or disinhibitions would have been better. Sorry.
I don't want that. I wanted to add Ian's comment, Tara, when you were talking. He said, I do those upsetting things, Tara. And I think that's the thing is he's not able to stop those upsetting things, the standing up, the screaming, the hitting, the banging on the table, those things. So he definitely related to that.
So Ben and Ian, And TJ, are you also nervous of going to doctors? Are you afraid that you will like be so dysregulated that you might like punch someone or you know, scream, cause some kind of disturbance? I have difficulty with touch, and I also have trauma from doctors, just gaslighting, trying to communicate with them and losing my language and going mute. Them treating me like I'm faking autism and health problems or whatever. I am so afraid of doing that I often get sent to the emergency room at the beginning of doctor's appointments because my blood pressure and my pulse will be in the "you're about to die, you're going to stroke out any minute" zone. Just from that level of extreme sympathetic nervous system response. TJ?
It is always a fear what I can do, but even more so for my middle child who has a lot of disinhibition issues, and I am afraid of their interactions with police.
Yes. And that is a very valid fear for anyone with a child with disinhibition, especially if you have a Black child with disinhibition in the United States. That is terrifying. And this is why not all behavior is communication is very important.
Ian said, I constantly worry I will lose my shit in public.
Yes, same. Did Ben have something? Awesome.
Ben said, "Oh, it is one of my biggest fears. Going to the doctors is extremely intimidating. It is a sensory overload."
Yes, it very much is. So I want to take it back to ABA, but before I say something about ABA, I want to say this is not just ABA, and I'm going to bring in speech and OT too. And we're going to put everybody together in this because we're using the same behavioral indicators and therapizing disinhibition in all three of these primary types of therapy. I want to say that ABA has by far the most potential for harm because insurance will approve up to 40 hours a week of this kind of therapy. So just the sheer volume of controlling someone who doesn't want to be controlled, neurologically, who hates control and needs autonomy more than most people, the sheer volume of putting them through that so many hours a week makes it 10 times more dangerous. But I don't want to just say ABA. Therapizing and trying to make people responsible for things that they cannot help. And let me also put church and fundamentalist religion, any religion, under this same umbrella. Anytime that you are constantly sending someone with disinhibition a message that they are purposefully doing a thing that they don't want to do and that they are bad for it and they need to change, you are pushing them farther. They are always going to have disinhibition and intrusive thoughts. They do not have to have OCD. They do not have to have this debilitating condition that ruins their lives. And when you start making them responsible for this, as opposed to saying, I realize this is not your consciousness, this is your brain misfiring. Let me support you. Let me ignore the sounds that you make that are not you. Or if you yell the F word at me at dinner, I know that you didn't want to do that. And not put you through therapy for that. But you can push somebody into, like a lifetime of doubting. They're already wired to overthink and doubt everything that goes through their head because intrusive thoughts. Intrusive thoughts become OCD when there's a demand to it. If you don't pray, your dad is going to die. If you don't touch this person right now, then it'll be your fault that they get in a car accident later. And they start becoming, they make your motor disinhibition, your intrusive thoughts, and your misery 10 times worse. So we cannot condition people who have these issues. Religious OCD is relatively common. It's a form of trauma OCD. And we cause that in the same way we cause trauma through ABA and other forms of therapy, by constantly policing behaviors that often are totally motor and cognitive disinhibition, and overriding someone's consent to make them feel like they're supposed to change all the time. It's not to say that we don't sometimes actually want to change things that we do. That's normal for every human. But when we unnaturally therapize children over and over, or condition them with other things like extreme religion that makes them feel like intrusive thoughts are going to make them burn in hell. I remember learning as a child, a preacher said, if you've hated someone, then it's the same as murder. Well, my autistic mind took that quite literally, and I spent the rest of my life worrying that I've constantly murdered people. Or that I was going to, just by having a thought that was intrusive that I didn't want to have. So, yeah. Anybody else want to take that one?
I will say that, I'm sorry, TJ, go ahead. I didn't see you coming off mic.
The importance of ABA thinking behaviors need to change is that they are mandated to constantly collect data. Then they have to do the entire next portions of therapy based on faulty data. Sometimes, entire school careers are based on faulty data. And this can carry over into adult services. And it paints an entirely inaccurate picture of a person.
Yes, thank you for that. Do you have from your device to copy and paste that? Because I want to save that. That is too brilliant to just hear one time and too important. Yes, that you can have faulty data and then define someone's entire education by that faulty data. Okay, Evie?
Yeah, I would say, as a speech language pathologist, an educator, and, people are trained to do and believe certain things. And, 19 years into my career, as, I was starting to get informed at that point by non-speaking people, I realized everything I'd been doing was wrong. And including that faulty data of testing, all testing for cognition, academics, intelligence, language requires a motor response. And so, we're looking and interpreting motor responses as data. And that, I think to TJ's point, is faulty data. And so then people are not presuming competence or treating someone who's 18 like they're 3 or so forth. Insides don't always match the outsides. And what we show from motor is not necessarily evidence of what someone, and not usually evidence of what someone understands or is thinking. So I think that's really important. And I think, the biggest thing we need to do is to listen to the voice of autistic and non-speaking people and, educate in order to change. So that's my own 2 cents worth. And then Ian, with regard to intervention, said, "Nothing I ever did led to my agency or autonomy before spelling." And I think in the therapeutic and educational community, we need to look at what are our end goals. And, I think often the clinical goal is not the same as the client's goals, and agency and autonomy are very important. And I think, that's not a clinical goal, that's a human goal. Most of us want to have a say in our lives.
And the question on the screen reads, my son is little 6-year-old. He has been doing STC for coming up on a year. We showed his ABA and OT therapist his spelling. How do we get others to believe and not knock my son down?
Terra, maybe I could start that conversation and others can pick up from there. But I've made it, well, actually, let's talk about the incident that sparked this. Somebody on Twitter annoyed me by doubting the agency of non-speakers. And I lost my cool. And I decided, out of anger, that I was going to be sharing the words of non-speakers every single day on Twitter now, because I was angry with this person for doubting this. Like, I'm going to flood my timeline with this. As it turned out, I didn't manage to put it off every single day, but I did a lot of it. And what emerged from there is that even though I am not non-speaking myself, and I'm not an expert at all the methods that you could possibly use for motor issues, it's just that I've read a lot of things that non-speakers have said, and I'm in advocacy and so on. People started to suddenly regard me as this expert on non-speakers, and every time that they came to me and they'd like, oh, follow Tanya because she knows all this stuff, I'd deflect that again and say, no, read what non-speakers say. And it became I don't want to use, well, I must find the right word for this, but it became a focus area for me, that I consistently just did this. I just kept on saying, listen to non-speakers, listen to non-speakers. Eventually I became involved in making a movie with using non-speakers. Now I'm possibly maybe going to get involved in another one, but I'm organizing events with non-speakers. If we focus, if we just do not give up, and you're not changing your story except for in the places where you learn more, then obviously you need to change, but you actually just focus on what that mission is, then eventually people kind of notice, because it's from repetition that people notice things. They just hear this from every time they see me. It's listen to non-speakers, listen to non-speakers, listen to non-speakers. Now, with regard to those teachers and how do you change the doubt, you don't go into too many different stories. You actually just say to them, read what non-speakers are saying. Then they'll tell you this and this and this. And I say, no, read what non-speakers are saying. They'll go into other stories. Then they'll start doubting the agency. Then you give them non-speakers who don't use letterboards. Give them non-speakers who are using other devices and who went straight to those devices. If they're non-speaking autistic people, they're going to tell you something like, oh, yes, well, I don't use a letterboard, but you should listen to the letterboard users too. You should listen to the spellers too. They're just using another form of AAC. You're going to hear the same message over and over. Now, when you're not prepared to listen to non-speakers, you're actually just not prepared to do anything that is useful for them. Why would you not want to listen to any of the people, that you pretend to target with your therapy or with your magnanimous care? I understand you may doubt some particular method because you're unfamiliar with it, but are you reading the writing of anyone, or are you just reading the writing of one person, maybe because you read Carly Fleischman's book and now you're thinking that's all that counts? You're just reading Carly Fleischman and Temple Grandin because those are your two autistic people. No, you need to read as many autistic people and listen to as many autistic people as possible, because we're very different. And when it comes to non-speakers, read as many non-speakers writing constantly as possible. If you're not prepared to do that, you're actually violating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, because that charter, or that convention, which is actually a treaty, is all about having the disabled people themselves, whatever their disability may be, taking agency and making their own decisions. You can't go and invent therapies and decide and write policies and so on without them just because they're very disabled. Like, how disabled are you allowed to be before you're involved in things like that? So
Well,
the message is just over and over. Listen to the actual people and what they say.
well, yeah. The people who have, and in case you are in the audience and not aware, because this is where we need you, we need your help. In case you're not aware, there has been this absurd push to block forms of spelling to communicate. And the American Speech and Hearing Language Association, I think I have that right, ASHA, they recently issued a position statement because these forms of therapy, or it's not a therapy, it's just a method of education, are becoming more popular. More people are getting access to communication. They issued a position statement to prevent therapists from using these practices, saying that they're not evidence-based. They're not evidence-based because for the last 25, 30 years, they've been bullying and blocking everybody who's trying to...
But there is evidence now.
Yeah, there's tons of evidence now, but they just continue to say there's no evidence. And they claim that non-speakers are just reading subtle cues from their communication partners. And they're not actually typing, they're just performing pointing. Which, if you have a therapy form that overrides the consent of a person and conditions them to behave in a totally different way, you don't get to say what something else is controlling. Okay, first of all, you don't get to say, if you condition people with what you call programming, you don't get to pretend you care about their autonomy, first of all, because you don't. And second, the people who are doing this have financial conflicts of interest. They create terrible AAC software. It might be good for some people, but it does not work for a lot of autistic people for things we've discussed today. They are creating these software programs, linguists, that are supposed to help people as if they have severe intellectual disability just to learn language, sight words, and things that, for the reasons we discussed, is not working for a lot of apraxic non-speakers with disinhibition. And so they do not want to say that this is effective because there is no more Judge Rotenberg Center shocking non-speaking people for motor tics and disinhibition, because that's what's happening now. They couldn't do that anymore. They can't put people in 40 hours of therapy anymore if we know that the problem is that they can't coordinate their movements, not that they are a wild animal who needs to be trained, because that's how they are treating people. So it is in the best interest of therapy industry giants, in the financial interest, to prevent these forms of communication. So we need everyone to learn about them. We need them to actively join us when we are trying to... Look, NeuroClastic posts about this all the time, and we can make a meme and get 7,000 shares. And then we talk about something very important related to non-speakers and radio silence. We need you to, like, if you were putting in as much effort to share things and to get involved in this, it will be a whole lot easier for us to shut down Judge Rotenberg Center and for us to stop harmful therapies, and also the amount of time spent in harmful therapies. Everything in autistic liberation hinges on this. this is their foundation, right? This is autonomy for people. This is not believing that all behavior is communication, and that we have to understand that we can't know what is in someone's head based on their external behaviors. And we have to empower them with tools that they need. And please help us. Okay. TJ, did you have a thing?
Is unnecessary. I think that forcing them legally and politically is a necessary thing we have to do now.
Yes. Thank you. I'm in. Who's with us?
Ian said, "Why am I required to demonstrate my intelligence or worth?"
Yes. And that's the thing. Why do they feel so entitled to that? Here we go. Somebody else is in with us.
Linking up with TJ and about that we have to take it up, what was the word, legally, or, can't remember the exact term.
Politically.
There is an international movement. It's not like united that everybody is part of the same club, but it's an international movement to doing exactly that. That behavioral therapies, which autistic people have not asked for and have never said en masse that this is really what they want or that it's helpful, that they actually need to be banned. And recently at the Global Disability Summit, we had a panel discussion of more than an hour on the subject of banning things which violate the UN Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. And most countries in the world are signatories to that. America is also a signatory, but has not ratified that. In other words, they have not agreed to turn it into law. So there it's a little bit harder to rest on the CRPD. But in other countries, they're obliged to, if they've signed this international treaty, to listen to autistic people who say that this therapy does not work for them and that it violates human rights, that it violates, in fact, so much of the research which claims to be evidence-based research about behavioral therapies actually also violates another international agreement, namely the Declaration of Helsinki, which is what you have to, if you're going to do experiments on humans, then you have to follow these rules and you have to get their consent. And if it's a child, you have to get their assent. And if they show certain things like that, they really don't want to be there and they're kicking and screaming and trying to run away, then you can't do this to them. And this is what we see in the experiments that they've been doing on children for decades. They've been violating their human rights. So if they say that it's evidence-based, and I did reading up about this, it aligns to what the United Nations would call torture. And I'm not just talking about electric shocks. If you're violating someone's human rights, you're placing them into discomfort, doing all of these things to get them to behave the way that you want. It's called torture, and you're not allowed to do research on torture because you can't get consent for torture. You can't do research on anything that you can't get consent or assent for. So yeah, there is a movement in New Zealand. Actually, the discussions are going quite well. In South Africa, I've contacted someone who is a parliamentarian and disabled and belongs to the same cross disability organization as I do, who's now handed me over to someone else, because ABA and conversion therapy for gay people have the same origin. That's the same people who kind of invented them, and then it kind of split into two parts and just got different names. So while they're busy planning to ban conversion therapy for gay people, we are trying to work to say you can't just ban it for one group of people. You should ban it for all groups of people. It just happens to have a different name. If somebody voluntarily, as an adult, wants to have this therapy, Well, voluntarily as an adult, other things which are considered torture in other contexts are also allowed. If you want to have yourself handcuffed and hit with a whip voluntarily, as a consenting adult, you may request a dominatrix to do that to you. And in a similar way, if you want something which in other contexts is defined as torture to be done to you, then you can't do that to a child. Your parent shouldn't be able to consent to, your parent can't consent to you being tied up and whipped and handcuffed. So similarly with these things which call themselves therapy, which are not evidence-based, but which claim to be, because you can't have evidence without, consent. That wouldn't count with the bad standards which they've had for this number of years. So yes, we are working internationally across a number of different countries at ensuring that legislators become aware of this. We will be working through our CRPD monitoring mechanisms as well. What that means is countries that have signed this need to have an independent body outside government, which the government lobbying groups are not allowed to touch, where we can go directly to them. And if our governments don't listen to us, they can go directly. This is a long process, but just to let you know where they actually sit. They can go to the United Nations and say, my government is not listening to me. Our government is not listening to us. So you must impose sanctions or do what you need to do and so on. So although that's unlikely to happen, but it's just to let you know the level at which these things are happening. Now, I have nominated a non-speaking autistic teenager, because they need them as well, to the advisory group for our monitoring mechanism in my country, South Africa. His name is Zakwanda Matenjwa. We were awaiting the outcome of that to see whether he gets that appointment. And in South Africa as well, the equivalent of ASHA, which in other words, the Speech Language Hearing Authority within our country, where all of those professionals have to be registered with him. They are very favorably disposed to listen to autistic people and listening to non-speakers. And these are people who you might think, oh, South Africa, America, doesn't have the same kind of clout. Our academics are recognized internationally. It's not that their degrees count for less. So if they publish something in a publication on this type of thing, it counts for as much as a professional from any other country. Just because they come from a country maybe has a smaller population, or it's in Africa, or it doesn't sound as smart as America, it counts for the same. They go to the same things. I'm in conversation with people who present at ASHA conferences as well on decolonization, which is a very important concept for us if we're trying to get human rights going for non-speakers, because it tends to be an intersectional problem. You're usually not marginalized just in one way. And we are in Africa, please note. Most people in Africa are not my skin color. Most people in Africa do not have the kind of dwelling that I live in. Communication is a human right. So we do need to have the laws taken a look at, and we are working at that to ensure human rights. Zakwanda himself is full-time in advocacy. He resigned from school to go full-time into advocacy because he knows we have 3 million plus non-speaking autistic people in Africa. They're going to live and die within our lifetime without ever being known if we don't do something about it. So we have a lot of work to do, and governments need to come to the party. Then we're working on getting them to do that.
I think that we just have a couple minutes to go, and Ben had something I feel is super important to say.
Ben said, there are always going to be people who knock you down and who do not believe, but proving yourself should be something that is done for you. Once you do that, it is hard for people to ignore the fact that you are as capable as anyone else.
Thank you so much. I'm going to put that in the chat too so that you can see, because that's one of those things that you got to sit with for a minute. And Ian had something too, I think.
Ian said, in the answer to Zoe's question of, I lost the question, of what are some things you wanted to say to people around you but couldn't before you gained access to spelling, Ian said everything, exclamation point. I want to participate. I want to be heard. Don't you?
I feel like that's the best place to leave this today. Tonight, if you go on Instagram at AshaWeb, and I'll put that in the chat again, they have a new CEO. And they have a live stream tonight. You can still sign up for it. Please, everyone who's with us today, make social media posts asking people, when you register, you get to ask a question. Please register and put the question that you want to be, when are you going to repeal the position statement against RPM and FC? And I'll type that in the chat. Or when are you going to support the Spellerverse or Spelling to Communicate? Because while you can access these therapies now, insurance is not going to cover them. And that is a human rights violation. And I said therapy, so what I mean is supports or forms of education, because it's not a therapy, it's just it's like combining physical therapy with literacy instruction. And sometimes spellers have been in school and they know very well how to read already. There's a documentary on Washington Post from Ben, and that's kind of how his mom figured out that he absolutely was a lot more capable than she realized. She asked him to point to octopus in a children's book, and instead of pointing at the picture, he pointed at the word. So she would ask him other things to point at in the book, and he wasn't pointing at the pictures, he was pointing at the words. And that's what led her to start that journey of finding reliable communication for him. But NeuroClastic.com, when you go, you see a tab at the top that says non-speakers. And we added a new article to that today. We add them all the time. There are videos on our Facebook and YouTube from non-speakers that you need to watch. And we are going to be posting a whole lot about this, and we need everyone's help. We are aggressively protesting ASHA because Judge Rotenberg Center is $276,000 a year to put a torture backpack on autistic kids and adults with disinhibition. Over $250,000. A letterboard is what? A laminated letterboard. How much does that cost, CV?
Like $7.
Right. And a stencil board like $25. Something like that. It is not too difficult. They want everything to be independent. They got to do it themselves or it's not valid. No, they get supports. They need supports. They get supports. They need a communication and regulation partner, and that's what they should have. They have a legal right to that. And if you can put a full security detail on someone in Judge Rotenberg Center so that they need 4 security people and a torture backpack that shocks them every time they stim, then why can you not just give them reliable communication? Because you say, these are the people with the most extreme behaviors who have concussed themselves and who've had detached retinas. Evie, how many of your clients have had concussions and detached retinas before and similar?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of long time injury sustained.
Yeah, me too. Guess what? Me too. I'm covered in scars. You want to shock me every day? No, because I can speak. And you wouldn't get away with it. But they do get away with it because they continue to say that behavior is communication and they're communicating dangerous behavior to themselves and others. But that is just because they have been tortured to not have any autonomy and not be able to communicate when they need to. No one's even tried to give them reliable communication. So we will put lots of posts in the near future about where you can get started, resources that you can access. We posted a few in yesterday's slideshow. Choice-based learning. So, you might not start with a letterboard, but there are ways that you can start with just putting choices and pointing to them. And that's a good start. So you can take those courses. They are inexpensive compared to everything else, at least. And thank you all. Anybody have a closing last thing before I hit? Okay, go ahead, TJ, and then I'll close it out.
On my highlights on my Instagram profile or Instagram non-speakers with a profile.
In one place.
And this on Instagram and Facebook. Is it Twitter the same too? Nigh Functioning Autism? Okay, so Facebook and Instagram, but yeah, check out Nigh Functioning Autism on Instagram. Great posts all the time.
It's a highlight of non-speakers that have Instagram profiles on my Instagram profile front page. So it's like a everybody in one place.
Amazing. And we have a directory on NeuroClastic that has, we add to it all the time, every time we learn of another non-speaker. And when we say non-speaker, that means also unreliably speaking and minimally speaking. And these are people who have never used speech as a reliable form of communication. So different from people with selective mutism who can go years without speaking, but that's a different type of being disabled, way of being disabled. So non-speakers, unreliable, and minimal speakers. And we will repost that on NeuroClastic too. Okay.
Terra.
Oh, yes.
I'm sorry. Ian and I have to jump off. However, I put it into the comments. Sorry, I'm having speech issues. I only have the private chat. I don't know why. But Boards and Chords is coming up on March 12th. And that is a concert of songs all written by non-speaking people who then directed their own music video to go with it. And so there will be people from all over, including a nice contingency from South Africa. And we would love to see you there. If you want to see what people are capable of when they have access to communication, this is pretty special. So we would love to see you all there. It's free. And we have 2 different times to catch the concert.
And
thank you for having us.
Thank you. And we had a question, what research articles can you suggest for learning more about disinhibition? If you look at any of the posts that NeuroClastic made about disinhibition, there is a ginormous list of research articles linked in all of those posts. Okay, bye everybody. Thank you so much. Bye.